Have you ever walked into a room and noticed how certain people immediately shift their energy when you arrive? Have you ever wondered why some individuals become visibly uncomfortable when you speak your truth, as if your very presence threatens something fundamental about their existence? What if I told you that your mind possesses a power so profound, so psychologically sophisticated that it literally terrifies those who have built their entire identity on manipulation and control? Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But what happens when who you truly are becomes a direct threat to those who live in carefully constructed illusions? What happens when your psychological strength becomes so evident, so unshakable that narcissists, those master manipulators who prey on psychological weakness, actually fear being in your presence? Stay with me through this deep psychological exploration, because by the end of this journey, you'll discover the 8 unmistakable signs that your mind has developed a strength so formidable, so psychologically advanced that it sends narcissists running for cover. And I promise you this, sign number 6 will completely revolutionize how you understand your own psychological power and why certain people seem to crumble in your presence. But before we dive deep into these transformative insights, I need you to understand something that most people never realize about the true nature of psychological strength and why it creates such terror in those who operate from manipulation and false superiority. According to Carl Jung, the human psyche is far more complex and powerful than most people ever dare to imagine. Through his groundbreaking research spanning decades of clinical observation and personal analysis, Jung discovered that certain individuals develop what he called psychological differentiation, a state of mental clarity, emotional stability, and self-awareness that becomes virtually impenetrable to manipulation, gaslighting, and emotional exploitation. But here's what Jung found most fascinating about these psychologically evolved individuals: they don't just resist manipulation through conscious effort, they actually expose it simply by existing authentically. Their presence alone, their way of being in the world, reveals the artificial hollow nature of narcissistic behavior. And this creates what Jung described as narcissistic terror, a deep primal fear that arises when someone's false self encounters genuine authenticity. Carl Jung said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But what happens when you've done the deep work of understanding yourself so thoroughly that others' attempts to irritate, manipulate, or control you simply bounce off your psychological armor like arrows off a fortress wall?" Now, before we explore these 8 profound signs, I need you to understand something crucial about what you're about to discover. If you're listening to this content, if something drew you to explore this topic, there's already a high probability that you possess several of these traits. Your intuition has guided you here because some part of you recognizes these patterns in your own experience. But don't start celebrating yet, because having a mind so strong that it terrifies narcissists comes with challenges, responsibilities, and social dynamics that you might not expect. It's not always easy being the person who sees through illusions when others prefer to live in comfortable deceptions. Sign 1. You refuse to accept surface-level explanations and penetrate psychological facades. Carl Jung discovered through his extensive work with patients and his own psychological analysis that most people accept convenient explanations because diving deeper requires courage that they simply don't possess. But you're different. Your mind automatically rejects surface-level explanations like a sophisticated immune system rejecting a virus. When someone gives you a convenient excuse for their behavior, your mind immediately asks, "But what's really happening beneath this explanation?" When someone presents a perfect image or tells a story that seems too neat, too convenient, you instinctively look for the cracks, the inconsistencies, the deeper psychological motivations driving their actions. This isn't cynicism or paranoia. This is what Jung called penetrating psychological insight. Your mind has developed the ability to see beyond masks, facades, and carefully constructed personas to the authentic psychological reality underneath. According to Carl Jung, the persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. Fittingly enough, a kind of mask designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other to conceal the true nature of the individual. But here's what makes your mind so terrifying to narcissists: you see right through their persona to the frightened, insecure individual hiding underneath. You don't buy their grandiose stories, their elaborate justifications, their carefully crafted image of superiority and confidence. Narcissists absolutely hate this trait because their entire existence depends on others accepting their carefully constructed facades without question. They need people to believe their stories, their excuses, their elaborate explanations for their questionable behavior. They require an audience that will accept their performance at face value. But your mind cuts through all of that psychological theater like a hot knife through butter. You see the manipulation behind their charm. You recognize the insecurity behind their arrogance. You identify the fear behind their aggression. Jung discovered that psychologically strong individuals possess what he termed unconscious detection, the ability to perceive psychological truths that others miss because they've learned to trust their intuitive understanding of human nature over socially acceptable explanations. When you refuse to accept surface-level explanations, you're essentially stripping away the narcissist's primary tool of operation, deception. You're forcing them to confront the reality that their psychological tricks don't work on you. And this creates a terror so deep that many narcissists will simply avoid you altogether rather than risk being truly seen. But here's where it gets even more interesting, and this is something most people don't realize about this psychological dynamic. Your refusal to accept simple answers doesn't just frustrate narcissists, it actually triggers their deepest existential fear, being truly known for who they are beneath their elaborate psychological defenses. Sign 2. You maintain unshakable emotional independence. According to Carl Jung, the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But notice what Jung said. If there is any reaction, some minds have become so psychologically secure, so emotionally sovereign, that they don't react to emotional manipulation attempts at all. This is you. This is the psychological reality you've created through your inner work and self-development. When others try to make you feel guilty for setting boundaries, you don't absorb their emotional manipulation. When someone has a tantrum designed to control your behavior, you don't take on their chaos as your own. When someone tries to make their emotional crisis your emergency, you maintain your center, your balance, your emotional equilibrium. Your emotional independence isn't coldness or lack of empathy, it's psychological sophistication. You've learned to distinguish between genuine emotions that deserve your compassion and manipulative emotional displays designed to control your behavior. Carl Jung said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But you've reached a level of self-understanding where others' emotional manipulation tactics don't irritate you. They simply don't affect you at all." Narcissists are absolutely baffled by this emotional independence because their entire playbook, their whole system of control depends on getting emotional reactions from others. They need you to feel guilty when they're upset, anxious when they're angry, responsible when they claim to be hurt by your reasonable behavior. But your emotional independence renders their tactics completely powerless. It's like they're speaking a language you no longer understand using tools that no longer work on your evolved psychological system. Jung called this phenomenon psychological non-absorption, the ability to witness others' emotional states without absorbing them into your own psychological system. You don't take on other people's emotional chaos because your sense of self has become too well defined, too stable, too psychologically mature. But here's what's truly terrifying to narcissists about your emotional independence. It reflects back to them their own emotional immaturity and psychological instability. When they see someone who doesn't need emotional drama to feel alive, who doesn't require constant emotional stimulation to feel engaged with life, it highlights their own emotional addiction and psychological dysfunction. Your calm, centered emotional state becomes a mirror that shows them everything they lack: genuine emotional regulation, authentic inner peace, and the ability to exist without creating chaos and drama for entertainment or control. Sign 3. You trust your own perceptions with unshakable confidence. Carl Jung discovered something profound about the nature of psychological strength when he said, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." This inner awakening, this deep self-knowledge creates an unshakable trust in your own perceptions that becomes absolutely terrifying to those who depend on reality distortion to maintain control. When someone tries to gaslight you, to make you question your own memory, your own senses, your own experience of reality, your mind doesn't budge an inch. You know what you saw, you know what you heard, you know what you experienced. And no amount of manipulation, no amount of confident assertion to the contrary, can make you doubt your own psychological perceptions. This unwavering trust in your own experience is psychological terrorism to a narcissist. Gaslighting is their nuclear weapon, their ultimate tool for psychological control and reality manipulation. They depend entirely on making others question their own perceptions so they can substitute their version of events, their interpretation of reality. But your mind has become like a fortress, impenetrable to these reality distortion tactics. You've developed what Jung called phenomenological certainty, absolute confidence in your own experience of reality. According to Carl Jung, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But for narcissists, the most terrifying thing is encountering someone who has done exactly that. Someone who trusts themselves completely. Someone whose self-knowledge has become so solid that external attempts to shake it simply bounce off harmlessly. But here's what's fascinating about this psychological dynamic. Your trust in your own perceptions doesn't just protect you from manipulation. It actually reflects back to narcissists, their own deep self-doubt and internal confusion. They see in you what they desperately lack: genuine self-trust, authentic self-knowledge, and the psychological security that comes from knowing yourself deeply. Jung discovered that individuals who trust their own perceptions have usually done extensive inner work to understand their own psychological patterns, their own blind spots, their own areas of potential self-deception. This inner work creates a calibrated trust. You trust your perceptions because you understand them, not because you're arrogant or refuse to consider other viewpoints. When narcissists encounter this calibrated self-trust, they realize they're dealing with someone who has achieved a level of psychological development that they themselves have never approached. This recognition creates what Jung called developmental terror, the fear that arises when someone realizes how far behind they are in their own psychological evolution. Sign 4. You don't need external validation to feel worthy or complete. According to Carl Jung, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But most people spend their entire lives seeking approval, validation, and recognition from others to feel worthy of existing, to feel valuable as human beings. Not you. You've developed what Jung called inner validation, the psychological ability to recognize your own worth independent of others' opinions, judgments, or approval. This internal source of validation is absolutely terrifying to narcissists because they live entirely on external validation. Their whole psychological system depends on constant admiration, praise, attention, and recognition from others to maintain their artificially inflated self-image. They assume everyone operates this way, because it's the only way they know how to exist. So when they encounter someone who genuinely doesn't need their approval, who doesn't seek their validation, who doesn't compete for their attention, it completely shatters their understanding of how human psychology works. It's like discovering that some people can breathe underwater when you thought everyone needed air to survive. But here's the deeper psychological dynamic at play. Narcissists use validation as a control mechanism. They give and withdraw approval strategically to manipulate others' behavior. They create validation addiction in their relationships, so they can control others by controlling the supply of approval and recognition. When you don't need their validation, you've essentially removed their primary source of power over you. It's like being immune to a drug that everyone else is addicted to. You can't be controlled through something you don't need. Carl Jung said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." Your inner validation represents this awakening. You've looked inside and found your own worth, your own value, your own sense of completeness, that doesn't depend on external recognition. Jung discovered that psychologically mature individuals develop what he called self-authorization, the ability to validate their own experiences, their own choices, their own worth, without requiring external confirmation. This doesn't mean you don't appreciate genuine compliments or constructive feedback. It means you don't need them to know who you are, or to feel good about yourself. This self-authorization becomes terrifying to narcissists, because it represents a level of psychological freedom they can't comprehend. They see someone who has escaped the validation prison they themselves are trapped in, and it triggers both envy and terror. Envy for what you have achieved and terror at what your independence means for their ability to control and manipulate. And now we're approaching the halfway point of these revelations, but I promise you the most powerful signs are still ahead. Sign number 6 is going to reveal something about your psychological strength that even you might not fully realize yet. Something that explains why certain people seem to have physical reactions to your presence. Sign 5. You recognize manipulation tactics immediately and respond from strength. Carl Jung said, "Everything unconscious dissolves when you shine the light of consciousness upon it." Your mind has developed this powerful spotlight of awareness that illuminates manipulation tactics the very moment they appear in any interaction, no matter how subtle or sophisticated the attempt. When someone uses guilt trips to control your behavior, you see it instantly for what it is. When someone employs emotional blackmail to get their way, you recognize the tactic immediately. When someone tries to isolate you from other relationships or make you dependent on them for information or emotional support, your psychological radar goes off like a fire alarm. But here's what makes your recognition so psychologically sophisticated. You don't just notice these tactics, you understand their psychological purpose, and you respond from a place of strength, rather than reactivity. According to Carl Jung, most people fall victim to manipulation because they're unconscious of the psychological dynamics at play. They react emotionally to manipulation tactics, without recognizing them as tactics, which means they get pulled into the manipulator's psychological web without even realizing it's happening. But your awareness allows you to respond rather than react. When you recognize a guilt trip, you don't feel guilty, you feel informed about the person's manipulative tendencies. When you spot emotional blackmail, you don't feel pressured, you feel educated about their psychological immaturity. This immediate recognition isn't just protective, it's absolutely terrifying to narcissists, because it means they can't gradually hook you into their web of control. Most manipulation works through what Jung called psychological erosion, the slow, subtle wearing down of someone's psychological defenses over time. Skilled manipulators know that if they can get someone to accept small boundary violations, they can gradually increase the level of manipulation until the victim is completely under their control. It's like slowly turning up the heat in a pot of water. The frog doesn't realize it's being cooked until it's too late. But your mind doesn't allow for this gradual erosion of your psychological boundaries. You spot the manipulation attempt from the very beginning, which means the narcissist has to show their cards early in the interaction. And nothing terrifies a manipulator more than having their tactics exposed before they've had a chance to work their psychological magic. Jung discovered that individuals with this level of psychological awareness possess what he termed tactical intelligence, the ability to see through social and emotional strategies designed to control, exploit, or manipulate others for personal gain. But here's what's truly frightening to narcissists about your tactical intelligence. It means they can't play the long game with you. They can't invest time and energy in gradually breaking down your defenses because you recognize their tactics immediately and respond appropriately to protect your psychological well-being. This forces them into a terrible position. They either have to abandon their manipulative approach entirely, which feels impossible to them, or reveal their true nature much earlier than they intended, which exposes them to consequences they're not prepared to handle. Sign 6. You remain calm in chaos and refuse to participate in psychological drama. According to Carl Jung, in all chaos, there is a cosmos. In all disorder, a secret order. But here's what makes your mind truly formidable. What makes your psychological strength absolutely terrifying to narcissists. You don't just understand this principle intellectually, you embody it completely. When others are losing their minds, when drama is exploding all around you, when emotional chaos is erupting in every direction, you remain centered, calm, and psychologically stable. This is the sign that absolutely terrorizes narcissists more than any other. And I'm going to explain exactly why this psychological trait creates such profound fear in those who depend on manipulation and control. Narcissists create chaos intentionally. This isn't accidental or unconscious. It's a deliberate psychological strategy. They thrive on drama, confusion, emotional turmoil, and psychological instability, because these conditions allow them to control the narrative, manipulate others' responses, and position themselves as either the victim or the hero depending on what serves their agenda. Carl Jung discovered that chaos creates what he called psychological vulnerability. When people are emotionally destabilized, their normal psychological defenses are compromised, making them much easier to manipulate and control. But when you remain calm in their carefully orchestrated chaos, you do something absolutely devastating to their entire strategy. You refuse to participate in their psychological theater. You don't take the bait, you don't escalate the drama. You don't give them the emotional reaction they desperately need to fuel their manipulative agenda. Jung called this psychological sovereignty, the ability to maintain your inner state of consciousness, regardless of external circumstances or other people's emotional manipulations. But there's something even more powerful happening when you remain calm in chaos, something that creates deep terror in the narcissistic mind. Your calm presence in chaotic situations actually exposes the narcissist as the source of the chaos. Think about this dynamic carefully. When everyone else is getting upset, reacting emotionally, losing their psychological balance, and you're the only one remaining centered and stable, it becomes obvious to everyone present who's actually creating the problem. Your calmness serves as a psychological mirror, reflecting back the narcissist's dysfunction for everyone to see. It becomes clear that the chaos isn't a natural result of circumstances. It's being artificially created by someone who benefits from psychological instability. According to Carl Jung, your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it. But narcissists have built their entire identity around creating barriers. Barriers to authentic connection, barriers to genuine intimacy, barriers to real understanding. Your calm presence in chaos reveals these barriers for what they are, artificial constructions designed to maintain control. But here's the deepest level of why your calmness terrifies narcissists. It demonstrates a level of inner peace and psychological development that they can't comprehend. They live in constant internal chaos, constant emotional turbulence, constant psychological instability. They assume everyone else lives this way too. When they encounter someone who has achieved genuine inner peace, who has developed real emotional regulation, who has cultivated authentic psychological stability, it shows them what they're missing. It reveals the emptiness and dysfunction of their own inner world. Your calm presence becomes living proof that there's another way to exist, another way to be human, another way to navigate life's challenges. And this realization creates what Jung called developmental panic. The terror that arises when someone realizes how far they've fallen behind in their own psychological evolution. Sign 7. You set and maintain firm boundaries with absolute consistency. Carl Jung discovered through his clinical work that knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people. Part of knowing your own psychological landscape, your strengths, weaknesses, needs and limits, is understanding exactly where your boundaries need to be, and having the psychological strength to maintain them consistently. You don't just set boundaries when it's convenient, or when you're feeling strong. You maintain them with absolute consistency, regardless of pressure, manipulation, or emotional blackmail. When you say no, you mean no. When you establish a limit, you enforce it without exception. When someone crosses a line, you address it immediately and directly.